This is the Hunsrück, West Germany, the late 1970s, late autumn, when the harvest is finally in. For generations, this was when the work began. Field work ends. Loom work starts. Inside this workshop in Dickenschied, two men are about to do something almost no one does anymore. Build a loom from loose pieces of oak using nothing but memory. Wilhelm Mosel, Otto Klohs. Both grew up around looms like this one, not as a craft they studied, as a part of how their families survived. They start at the bottom. The base frame, what's called the schemmel, goes together first. No screws, no nails, just oak meeting oak in joints cut a century ago by a village carpenter who never wrote anything down. Every loom like this was custom built, not for a standard size, for one weaver in one room. The carpenter measured the man's height, the shape of his kitchen, his reach. That means no two of these looms are quite the same. This one is over 100 years old, and it has exactly one home it was built to fit. Wilhelm lifts the first vertical post. Otto guides it into the base, one strike of the mallet, then another. The mortise and tenon joint takes the load. No metal involved anywhere in this frame. The crossbeam goes in next, locking the top of the post to its mate. Wilhelm drives a wooden peg through a hole bored straight through both pieces of wood. That peg is the only thing standing between a stable loom and a pile of lumber on the floor. He hammers it home. No glue, no fasteners, just friction and wood swelling tight against wood. This kind of joinery was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be taken apart every year and put back together exactly the same way for as long as the family needed a loom. The rear posts go up the same way the front did. Same motion, same mallet, same two men, fitting a structure neither one of them had to be taught twice. Most farm households along the Hunsrück once owned a loom exactly like this. Some wove linen to clothe their own family, others sold what they made at market. Either way, the loom was rarely a luxury. It was simply how a household stayed dressed through the winter. Now come the side braces, long horizontal beams that tie the front posts to the back. Wilhelm carries one across the frame. Otto receives it on the far side. Together, they guide its tenon into a waiting mortise, then drive it flush with the mallet. A wooden peg locks it permanently in place. This frame was built to survive decades of hard use without ever loosening. Weaving puts real force through every joint, the constant hammer strike of the beater against the cloth, thousands of times a day. If the frame were weak, it would shake itself apart within a season. So every peg, every joint exists for exactly one reason, to keep that violence contained inside a structure that never moves. The lower rear beam goes in last, locking the bottom of the frame the same way the top was locked. Wilhelm taps it level. Otto checks the angle from across the room. What's emerging now is the full skeleton of what's called a Vollwebstuhl, a full-frame loom common across the Eifel and the Hunsrück, built so its side posts are connected top and bottom by crossbeams on every side. Now the Tuchbaum, the cloth beam. This is where the finished linen will wind onto, inch by inch, as it comes off the loom. Wilhelm and Otto lift it together and lower its squared ends into open sockets cut for exactly this purpose. He turns it once by hand. It spins freely. That's the test. If it doesn't turn smooth now, it never will once there's tension on it. More bracing follows, lower cross supports that stop the frame from racking side to side. Wilhelm strikes each joint home, then checks it by hand, feeling for any give. There shouldn't be any. Above, the top rails close the loop, joining front to back across the highest point of the frame. This is the last of the open box structure. After this, every piece that goes in is mechanical, moving parts, not static ones. The frame's job was simple: hold still. The next job is harder: make things move correctly, thousands of times, for years. Wilhelm checks the top corners one more time before pegging them for good. A hole is bored straight through the joint. A long wooden peg goes in. Then the mallet, driven down until the peg sits flush with no gap at all. Otto repeats it on his side. Two men, two corners. The exact same motion, learned the exact same way, likely from someone in their own family decades earlier. Here's a detail almost no one notices in old loom photographs. The pegs stick out past the joint on purpose so they can be driven in fully without splitting the wood. Once they're seated, the excess has to come off. Wilhelm sets his mallet against the protruding end and strikes once, hard. The peg snaps off clean, flush with the frame. No saw, no chisel, just controlled force at exactly the right angle. Why bother? Because a loom this size gets brushed past constantly while weaving. A protruding peg catches fabric. It catches sleeves. It catches thread mid-weave and ruins hours of work in a second. So every peg on this frame gets struck flush, one at a time, until nothing sticks out far enough to catch on anything at all. With the frame complete, it's heavy. Heavy enough that moving it takes both men. They lift one side, slide it across the workshop floor, and walk it into its final position against the back wall. This is where it will stay, not because the loom can't be moved again, because it doesn't need to be. Its work is about to begin right here. Two more beams now, the Brustbaum, the breast beam, and just behind it, the Kniebaum, the knee beam. The breast beam is where the woven cloth passes just before it winds onto the Tuchbaum. Its surface has to be perfectly smooth. Any roughness here damages thread that took weeks to prepare. Wilhelm lowers it into curved brackets built for exactly this shape. Otto steadies the far end. These two beams sit closest to where the weaver will actually work, hour after hour, for the rest of this loom's working life. Every measurement here was made for a person, not just for wood. Wilhelm fits the foot treadles, two long wooden pedals that will let the weaver work the loom without ever standing up. An iron rod runs through the base frame and through both pedals, giving them a single pivot point. He tests the swing. Smooth, even, no resistance. The Kettbaum, the warp beam, is the heaviest single piece in this entire loom. It's hollowed along its length with a long slit where the very first threads of the new fabric will be anchored before weaving even starts. Wilhelm and Otto lift it together, raise it to shoulder height, and seat its iron ends into waiting brackets at the rear. Then comes the wheel, a wooden gear, toothed by hand, fitted onto the beam's end. A wooden pawl drops into its teeth. That's the entire braking system. No metal spring, no machined part, just one carved tooth catching another, and it works exactly as well today as it did when this loom was new. Otto turns to the Tuchbaum and fits its own ratchet, this one toothed in iron rather than wood, since this beam takes far more daily strain. He locks a metal pawl against the teeth, then winds the beam by hand to test the click of each tooth catching. Wilhelm ties a rope to the rear ratchet's release lever and threads the cord the full length of the frame to the front. Now the weaver can release tension on the warp beam from their seat without ever standing up, without ever reaching toward the back of the loom at all. Wilhelm sets the seat board across the front rails, the one place on this entire structure built purely for comfort. Behind him, Otto sits with a small knife, shaving a sliver of wood at a time. He's not idle. He's making the wooden pins that will anchor the warp threads later, each one tapered by hand into a perfect, tiny wedge. No two need to be identical. They only need to hold. Now the heaviest moving part of the entire loom, the Weblade, the beater. Wilhelm and Otto carry it in together and hang its top pivots from the high side rails, like hanging a gate. He pushes it once. It swings forward and back, smooth as a pendulum. Every single thread of cloth this loom ever produces will be driven into place by this exact motion, repeated thousands of times. Otto brings the Geschirr, the harness, a tangle of cord, wood, and metal that looks more complicated than it is. Inside it is the Ried, a comb-like blade that the weaver will use to beat each new thread tight against the cloth. Older reeds like this were once made from reed grass stems. By the 19th century, most had shifted to thin metal teeth instead, sturdier, less easily broken. Wilhelm slides it into the beater's lower groove and clamps the top rail down to lock it in. Inside the harness hang the shafts, two cord frames, each one threaded with tiny metal eyes at its center. Every single warp thread will pass through one of these eyes. Otto separates the old cords still hanging from a previous weave, left there deliberately, because they make tying in the next batch of thread far faster. Wilhelm hoists both shaft frames up to leather straps overhead, then adjusts the hanging cords until the frames hang level with each other. If they don't hang even, the whole weave shifts out of true the moment work begins. Wilhelm kneels beneath the frame and ties the lower shaft cords to the treadles below, left shaft to left pedal, right shaft to right. He presses one pedal by hand. One shaft drops, the other rises. That single motion, one frame up, one frame down, is the entire mechanical heartbeat of weaving linen on a loom like this one. Wilhelm steps back. Otto stands beside him. In front of them, a fully working loom, built today exactly the way it was built generations ago. Because once these skills are gone, the joinery, the pegging, the hand-carved gears, all that remains is the record. Subscribe. More of these trades are coming.